Hi everyone, welcome again to Introduction to Philosophy. I'm really sorry that this second lecture is also a video lecture. That definitely was not my plan, but the weather was against us and I didn't want to fall so far behind right at the beginning of term. So what I'm going to do today is do my best to introduce you a bit to the Dennett reading that we did for this week and maybe talk a little bit about the Egan. We'll see how far we get. Although I will save the really tricky stuff for class on Wednesday. But I wanted to make enough headway that you're in a position to do your reflection paper this week as planned, and I don't want us to be off schedule right from the start. So, sorry, be a little bit patient with the video format, and we'll do our best. In general, I'm sorry that this first couple weeks of this class is so chaotic. There's a huge wait list to the class still. I know things are still sorting themselves out. Weather and my travel plans both messed everything up, but hopefully after this week is over, we will be on track, smooth sailing, and everything will be normal for the rest of the term. Let's see. Before I dive into the Dennett, I want to say a little something about just what it is to study philosophy. A lot of people have trouble even defining what philosophy is, including philosophers themselves don't have any agreed upon definition of what philosophy is. But I know a lot of undergraduates who sign up for Introduction to Philosophy and might have a sort of an unclear idea what the discipline is, think that they're going to come to an Introduction to Philosophy class and get sort of the answers to the big questions. Is there a God? What is the meaning of life? That kind of thing. If anything, though, I think that actually philosophy as a whole is kind of the exact opposite of that. The major goal of philosophy, and I know this sounds frustrating, and for some of you it will be frustrating, and for others it will be really fun and exciting. The major goal of philosophy is to leave you in the position of knowing less than you did when you started. Or, to put the point more precisely, leaving you in the position of realizing that you don't know or understand things that you thought you knew. One of the main jobs of philosophy is to take common concepts that we go around using all the time and don't really question, don't really think of that carefully, and pick apart at them and push at them and think about them critically until we realize we really don't understand very well what that concept means, and we've been using it kind of as a black box without actually being able to cash out what we mean by our own words. Philosophy is all about questioning assumptions that seemed totally given, probing at the meanings of concepts that felt obvious but weren't really, drawing distinctions between ideas in ways that can reveal to us that we don't have a great grasp even of the things that we thought we believed really solidly. So if this class goes well and is successful, you're going to come out of this class thinking that you have less of a grasp of what the self is, what justice is, what morality is, than you did when you went into the class. This can be super annoying. The first really well-known philosopher, as you probably know, was Socrates in ancient Greece, and he was literally executed by the state specifically for being annoying in this way. The thing that people hated about Socrates was that his goal in conversations was to make people realize that they didn't know what they thought they knew, and they got so sick of it that they literally killed him. So hopefully you won't kill me and we won't kill each other. But just to warn you in advance, you're going to do a lot more raising of questions here and thinking about how to critically tease apart things that felt obvious than we're going to do any kind of settling on answers. The first section of this class is a great example of that, and our first readings are a particularly good example. So our first unit that we're going to spend the first few weeks on basically asks, what kind of a thing is the self? What am I? What makes me me as opposed to somebody else? This is really a two-part question. What am I? One thing you might be asking is, what is it to be the kind of thing that I am? What is it to be a person or a self? And another related but different thing that you might be asking is, what is it to be this self, the particular self that I am, as opposed to some other self? We're going to put both of those things into question and show why those are tricky questions. And one of the things I like about both the Dennett reading and the Egan story is that both of them pick apart and find fractures in our concept of the self that we might not have even noticed were there in order to show us ways in which our understanding of what makes us us is actually quite unstable, and our understanding of what a self is actually quite unstable. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about the Dennett and the Egan reading. Well, actually, let me make one more point about instability first. Both Dennett and Egan, in some sense, use the same method. What they do is they show how our understanding of the self is tricky and unstable, specifically by coming up with stories that separate from one another things that we typically assume go together. Some of those things that they separate out are the brain, the body, our will, right? Like our will to do something, the actions that result from that will, our experiences, and our memories. All of these things typically go together. Our brain stays in our body, and our brain and our body together will things, and when we will to do something, we actually do it, and then when we do it, we experience ourselves doing it, and then later we remember ourselves doing it, and all those things are in a nice, neat package, and so we don't have to ask which of these are parts of the self. Is the self the will? Is the self our experiences? Is the self the brain? Because these things just come as a package deal, and we're not forced to question it. But both Dennett and Egan find ways of peeling these things apart from one another so that we lose our intuitions about how the self comes together as a whole and what makes one self that particular self as opposed to some other self. Dennett in particular, Egan also, both of these are philosophical pieces that are written as short stories, but the Dennett piece is more overtly philosophical than the Egan piece to some extent, right? What Dennett is doing in this piece is conducting what philosophers call thought experiments. He's concocting situations, making up narratives and setups where the narrative background functions kind of like a laboratory, right? That's why we call it thought experiments. Basically, the game is to say, well, if things were like this, if we had this funny situation, what would follow? Let's use our imagination to see where our intuitions would go if we were in this weird situation. It's a distinctively philosophical method to use thought experiments like this, and in some sense, thought experiments are tricky because you don't know what would happen in a fictional situation. We're kind of making it up as we go along, right? But the point of a thought experiment is to get you to think imaginatively about your understanding of these concepts once we set the concepts in weird background situations that are going to allow us to see ways in which they are unclear or divide into parts or are in tension with themselves that we wouldn't have seen outside of that background situation. All right, so let's spend most of today's lecture on the Dennett. I might not even get into the Egan until Wednesday. I'm not quite sure yet, or I might make a point or two about it as I go along. In any case, what's the point of Dennett's story, right? What Dennett does is he takes a whole self where all those things go together, brain, body, experience, will, action, memory, etc. And he constructs a narrative in which those things come apart from one another piece by piece by piece. So there's a gradual escalating deconstruction of the self, and with it, increasing instability in our concept of the self. And he shows as he goes that we can't easily identify the self with any of these parts or with any of the clear combinations of the parts. And so what we're going to be left with at the end is, and he doesn't come to any settled conclusions, that's part of what I meant about philosophy, asking questions rather than giving answers, but what we're left with at the end is the idea that either the self is some weird, tricky combination of these things that we don't understand yet, or equally maybe our concept of the self just doesn't work at all. Our common sense concept of personhood and selfhood and identity might not correspond to anything coherent that we can actually spell out. Maybe the self in its common sense form is just an illusion. He doesn't come to the conclusion that it's an illusion, but he raises that as a possibility. Either it's an illusion or it's some definite thing that we don't understand very well. So he starts with the easiest cut, which is between brain and body. And so he starts out by asking, in effect, am I my brain or am I my body? Which one is the self? And the way that he asks this question is by setting up this imaginary mission where they get separated from one another, right? So as you remember, he is involved in this elaborate setup where his body needs to go deal with toxic materials, but it's too risky for his brain. So scientists find this way to physically separate his brain from his body while still keeping his brain in control of his body. Later on in the story, as you remember, the connection between his brain and his body is going to become damaged, so his brain isn't even going to be controlling his body anymore. But at the beginning of the story, it is. They're just physically distanced from one another. Later in the story, that connection is damaged, so they give him a new body. And yet later in the story, it turns out that he actually has a backup brain, so he can use a new brain. So by that point in the story, he's not using his original body or his original brain, and none of them are in connection with one another in the normal way. And by the end of the story, it's all become completely fragmented, as you'll remember. But at the beginning, it's just a separation of his brain and his body. And then the question that he asks is, once they're separated, well, which one am I? Which one is Dennett? Right? I'm going to say I and mean Dennett. Am I my brain? Am I my body? Am I some combination of my brain and my body? Or am I something else altogether? Or am I nothing? Is there no such thing as the self, and the self is a confused notion? Right? You get the simplest version of this question on page 2, where he asks, okay, once we're separate, and his body goes and looks at its brain, right, sitting there in a vat, am I my brain being looked at by my body, or am I my body looking at my brain? Which one is me, and which one is the part of me that has been separated from me? Where am I? And whatever else is true, he points out that the seat of control is the brain, right? The brain is the one that is controlling the action. But the seat of experience is the body, right? So it's the brain that is controlling action, but it's the body that is settled. Sorry, let me put that bit again. The seat of control is the brain. The seat of experience is the body. So although the brain is controlling the action, what Dennett, is feeling and seeing is based on where his body is, not on where his brain is, right? His body is out walking around, getting hot, cold, hungry, having various experiences. And those experiences are based on where the body is, not where the brain is. He brings on the notion of an indexical, which is going to be important for us. An indexical is a term like I or here or now. What's interesting about indexicals is they don't refer to anything unless we have more information, right? The word I or the word here, those are perfectly good, meaningful words, but in order for them to be meaningful, in order for them to refer to or pick out anything in particular, we have to have a locked down point of view. So when you say, I'm wearing a red shirt today, doesn't matter if it's true or false, right? When you say, I'm wearing a red shirt today, you're making a claim about you. When I say, I'm wearing a red shirt today, I'm making a claim about me, Rebecca Kukla, and the shirt that I'm wearing. You can't fill in the meaning of an I sentence unless you know which self is making the claim, right? And likewise, if I say it's cold here, the meaning of here, the reference of here, is only filled in depending on my perspective, where I am, how I'm located, right? So the point is, when Dennett uses indexicals, when he talks about I or here, where is the point of view locked down? What is holding down that indexical? What is it to have a point of view or a perspective or a location at all? What is it for an experience to show up as my experience as opposed to somebody else's experience? Obviously, every experience I have is my experience, but there's a deeper question about what that my is that attaches that experience to me. And normally we don't even have to ask that because it's all very unified and we don't even notice that there's an issue there. But what Dennett notices as soon as his brain and his body are separated, and here's the real point, is that the indexicals seem to be locked down by his body and its location rather than his brain, right? When he experiences a location as here, the here he experiences is where his body is, not where his brain is. And that's not obvious until you do the thought experiment, because if you think of the brain as the seat of the self, then you should think that its location is what gets to define your here. He only notices afterwards, phenomenologically, in the story, that the here is defined by the sensations and experiences of the body, not by the processing of the brain, or so it seems. Right? So the indexicality seems to be focused on the body and not the brain, and that's his first surprising conclusion. So he says early on in the piece, quote, being a philosopher of firm physicalist convictions, I believed unswervingly that the tokening of my thoughts was occurring somewhere in my brain. Yet when I thought, here I am, where the thought occurred to me was here outside the vat, where I, Dennett, was standing and staring at my brain. So he believes, because science tells us that thoughts happen inside brains, I am here certainly seems to be a thought. And so that thought surely is happening inside his brain, and so his brain should be the source of the here, and yet it doesn't seem to be. It seems like the here that he experiences, the actual sensory surroundings of his body, are what lock down the here. So what we see already here is that there are two different perspectives possible, and that we don't expect them to conflict, but they do. When we're asking, where's the real self, if we take a sort of outside, impersonal, scientific view of that question, then we want to say, well, the seat of the self is the brain, that's where the processing happens, that's where the control is happening, so that's where the real self is. That's the sort of objective outside view on it. But from an insider perspective, from what philosophers call a phenomenological perspective, that is, a perspective rooted directly in first-person experience, it doesn't seem like we can get past the intuition that the here is where our body is. Again, when you're trying to figure out if you agree with him or not, it's kind of an interesting question, because this isn't like, this isn't exactly an argument, and it's certainly not a scientific experiment. Again, it's a thought experiment, and a thought experiment is an odd thing. You're supposed to imaginatively project yourself into the story and see that if you were in that circumstance, like Dennett, you wouldn't be able to help but experience yourself as where your body is, even if you had scientific beliefs that told you that where your real self is where your brain is. So he says, either I was doomed by sheer force of mental habit to thinking systematically false indexical thoughts, or where a person is not necessarily where his brain resides. In other words, he's saying he can't change the phenomenology. No matter how hard he tries to think of his indexical location, his here, as where his brain is, he literally simply can't. His experience is somewhere other than the brain. His experience is off where his body is. He can't make himself experience the brain's location as a here. Right? That's an interesting thought about indexicals. Like, you can't control where your here is, right? So his point is, well, either my scientific belief is wrong and I'm not the brain after all, or all of my indexical beliefs are now wrong, and what I'm experiencing as here is not where I really am. Okay, so he goes through in turn trying to figure out which of those two halves is right. He says, look, I can't help my phenomenology. I can't help that I'm experiencing myself as where my body is. So which am I? Am I the body or am I the brain? Well, let's say I'm the body. Let's say I am to be identified with my body, which he calls Hamlet. So one hypothesis is Dennett is Hamlet. The problem with this, he says, is, look, if somebody takes my brain and puts it in a new body, I'm going to say, I have a new body. I'm not going to say, I have a new brain. Just stop and think about that for a moment and see if you agree. If your brain, the piece that thinks and processes, is taken and placed into a new body somehow, the way you're going to experience that indexically is, I have a new body. You're not going to experience that indexically as, I have a new brain put into me. right? So in that sense, your identity goes with consciousness, and the brain is the seat of consciousness. So from that point of view, it seems like what we should say is that the self is the brain, and this phenomenological effect of the here being somewhere else is just an illusion produced by his weird science fiction circumstances. Right? So that's an argument against the self being the same as the body. We can call it the transplant argument. He says, okay, well, so there's problems with thinking of the self as the body. Let me instead think of the self as the brain. Let's see if that works. Well, the first problem with that is the one we've already been talking about, which is that it seems to contradict the obvious experience of what's happening to him right now. He experiences himself as where his body is, not where his brain is. But maybe his experience is just deceptive and he's just wrong about that. He says, well, but look, if I were to commit a crime and somebody were to want to put me in jail to keep me trapped in a single location, you're not going to catch me by incarcerating my brain and leaving my body free, right? If you take the brain, which in this story is sitting there in a vat, and you move that vat into a jail cell, and that brain is still controlling the body, which is out free in the world doing all kinds of things, you're in effect not jailed. You don't care if your vat is in a jail cell or in a scientific laboratory or anywhere else, as long as the brain is working, right? What you care about is where your body is. You don't care where your brain is, you care where your body is. And if your body is outside the jail, off doing whatever you wanted to do, then it doesn't seem like you've been incarcerated. This sounds like just a cheesy point, but there's a really deep point there, which is that what it is to incarcerate you, yourself, your selfhood, is not to incarcerate your brain in this science fiction circumstance, right? Again, remember, normally brain and body are in the same place, and so we can't even ask these questions. But assuming they've been separated from one another, what it is to incarcerate you is not to incarcerate your brain, it's to incarcerate your body. And so that seems to tell against the idea that the actual self is the brain. Because, of course, when we have an incarceration system, when we jail people, what we want to jail is selves, not just some odd appendage of the self. Right? So then, third possibility, he says, okay, so there's problems with thinking of me as my body, because if I were to transplant my brain into a new body, I would think I had a new body, not a new brain. And there's problems thinking of myself as my brain, because my brain doesn't seem to be the seat of my phenomenological selfhood, the selfhood that we actually care about. So he says, well, it seems like this flips back and forth based on circumstances, so maybe I'm just wherever I think I am. Maybe there's no truth of the matter, and wherever I'm experiencing myself as being, that's where my real self is. So if I'm undergoing a body transplant, then I'm going to experience myself as being the brain, and if I'm in this circumstance in the story where my body's off having experiences, my brain is in a vat, I'm going to experience myself as being my body, right? I'm just identified with my point of view. What my point of view is going to flip depending on circumstances. This is a way of making the self ultimately pretty dissolved or unstable, right? It becomes just like, it's not like there's an entity on this view, which is the real self. It's more just that selfhood travels around with perceived selfhood. And he says, well, look, that can't be right either. I can't just be wherever I experience myself as being or wherever I think I am, because surely it must be possible for me to find out I'm wrong about where I am, right? There are all kinds of cases where I think I'm in one place and then it turns out I'm in some other place, right? I might get lost and take a wrong turn and realize I'm in a different place, or I might have a really realistic dream in which I think I'm in a place and then I wake up and I realize I wasn't in that place. There are all sorts of circumstances under which we can realize that we're confused about where we are. But if we can be confused about where we are, then we can't say that the self is just wherever it thinks it is or wherever it experiences itself as being, or there won't be that room for error. Right? Along these lines, he points out, look, we have technology now that can artificially shift our experience of where we are. So this article was written a little bit too early for VR technology to be a real thing, but now we have VR technology. But even aside from VR technology, if you get really immersed in a video game, like really deeply into it, and your hands are working a controller, you really start to, after a while, experience yourself as being in the space of the video game, right? You're not experiencing yourself as playing with a controller, you're experiencing your hands as doing whatever the character is doing. You're experiencing yourself as out there in the video game world. Same with various kinds of simulations. You've probably been to like science centers and amusement parks where they have simulations where you get inside and you experience yourself as if you're in a rocket ship or whatever it may be, right? Or just prosthetic limbs and various other kinds of technologies that can make your body experience itself as being somewhere other than where it is. It would be very weird and unscientific to say when you have these illusory experiences of being somewhere other than where you are, that they're not illusory, that yourself actually did somehow amazingly shift over into this new space, right? You're not literally in the video game space when you experience yourself as being in the video game space. So there has to be the possibility of error, which means that even though point of view seems to be super essential to what we mean by the self can't just be its point of view. Interestingly, along these lines, there are a lot of contemporary philosophers who want to say, okay, that's true, you can be wrong about where you are, but maybe technology really does let us change where we are. Maybe part of ourself can be in the technology to some extent. So there are interesting questions like, if you keep your calendar on your phone and you store all kinds of information on your phone and you're incredibly fluid and good at using that phone to call up information when you need it, is there a sense in which the phone becomes part of your brain and part of yourself, right? Kind of literally an extension of the self. You can think of other kinds of examples of technology where you become, as it were, is a flaky way of putting it, but it makes the point. You become one with the technology, right? You become so fluid at interacting with this technology and you offload traditional functions of the self onto the technology to the point where the technology really does seem to function as part of you. I mean, after all, if you have, I'll leave that point to one side. But in any case, if you, there are plenty of philosophers who would accept the idea that you can, in effect, relocate or extend or change the shape of the self beyond the boundaries of the fleshy body by having that kind of relationship to technology. But even if that's true, and it's a cool idea, that sometimes when technology shifts your point of view, it's because it's really changing the boundaries of the self. Still, Dennett is surely right that the self can't just be identical to its point of view, because sometimes we have to admit that we're confused about where or who we are or what we're doing. Okay, so we went over the hypothesis that Dennett just is his body. There were some problems with that. The hypothesis that Dennett just is his brain. There were some problems with that. The hypothesis that Dennett just is wherever he thinks he is or wherever he experiences himself as being, and there's some problems with that. And then finally he says, well, maybe I'm in two places at once. Maybe my parts are scattered, like part of me is in my brain and part of me is in my body, and I'm making a mistake by trying to figure out which one the real self is. Maybe the real self is just sort of distributed. And his response to this option is interesting. He says, well, maybe, but we sure, in everyday life, we sure think of the self as something which is like one unified thing. There is a thing which is you. And to say that the self can be fragmented and distributed across all these different kinds of things seems to be a way of actually kind of dissolving the self and saying that we might talk about selves as a kind of a convenience, but there is no metaphysical thing which is the self, right? He doesn't reject that possibility, but that's a pretty radical possibility, that there aren't really selves. There's just scattered bits of things that we sort of tend to group together because we're not normally in this weird science fiction circumstance and we think of them as making up a self. But maybe, he says, we are looking for this entity, the self, this thing, this real thing, and that's just a misguided thing to look for. Maybe selves aren't the kinds of things which are unified entities or real things that we can find. That hypothesis actually goes all the way back to Hume, who was a super important philosopher of the Enlightenment several hundred years ago. We're going to loop back to him several times, 18th century philosopher. Hume had what he called the bundle theory of the self, which is that there isn't really any such thing as personal identity. there's just a bunch of stuff that tends to go together and bump up against one another, which is like our memories, our experiences, our body, our sensations, our pains and pleasures. There's nothing holding all of that together in a single entity. That's just all there is the bundle, the big pile of stuff. And the only reason that we think that there's such a thing as a unified self is that we tend to associate these things with one another because they usually go together. But if we were to find ourselves in the kind of situation that Dennett is in this story, and those things all got split up from one another, there wouldn't be any self that got lost because there wasn't any unified thing to start with. There's also a version of this hypothesis in Buddhist philosophy, that there's no such thing as a substantial self, that the self is an illusion brought about by the fact that we associate together or tie together these various things that are actually, we think of them as parts or pieces of the self, but actually they're just a bunch of things that co-travel together without any substantive self there. So there's something appealing about that hypothesis, but again, it's a pretty radical hypothesis. So if that's the way we're going to go, we're giving up on a lot of common sense, because in everyday common sense speech, we are perfectly comfortable saying that, you are one self and I'm one self, and that room over there has exactly 3 selves in it, or whatever it might be. We're comfortable saying things like, oh, she's really changed, but she's still the same person she always was. But all of that language would just be sort of metaphorical and imprecise if there isn't really such a thing as the substantive self. All right, that's a big chunk of lecture. I'm going to pause and be right back, but I'm just going to break this up so this video isn't too huge.